In the cold October dust of Wyoming, two sisters stood barefoot on an auction platform, holding each other. A cowboy counted gold coins with trembling hands, not to buy property, but to buy back their childhood. There are moments on the frontier that divide time in half. Before and after, the world you knew, and the world that replaced it while you stood there, watching with your hands at your sides and your heart making decisions your mind had not approved. The Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1873 was a land that tested everything it touched. The wind came down from the mountains carrying cold that did not ask permission to enter your bones. The grass stretched in every direction like a golden ocean frozen mid-wave. The sky was so vast that a man standing beneath it could feel himself shrinking until he was nothing more than a heartbeat wrapped in leather and dust. This was country that did not care about human plans. It had its own plans. They involved snow and silence and distances so enormous that loneliness became a companion you stopped trying to leave behind and started setting a plate for its supper. Silas Cain understood this country. He was 35 years old, broad and weathered in the way that decades of frontier living weathers a man, not broken down, refines. The way wind refines stone by removing everything that is not essential until what remains is hard and smooth and built to last. His face told his story without requiring words. Dark beard trimmed short against the cold. Deep lines around eyes that had spent years squinting into distances most people would never see. A jaw that looked carved from the same granite that formed the mountain ridges to the west. Dark brown eyes that held two things simultaneously. A quiet, steady warmth buried beneath a careful practice distance. He worked cattle. He ran a small ranch in the foothills where the grass was good, and the creek ran year-round, and the wind could not reach as deeply as it reached on the open plains. He had 40 head, a cabin he had built himself from timber he had cut and cured and fitted together with the patience of a man who understood that anything worth building required time. He lived alone. He had always lived alone, not because he chose solitude, but because solitude chose him the way the territory chose its survivors, through a process of elimination that left standing only those who could endure their own company without losing their minds to the silence. His parents had died when he was 14. Fever took them both in the same week. He had been raising himself ever since. 21 years of answering only to the land and the cattle and the quiet voice inside his chest that occasionally reminded him that survival and living were not the same thing. He ignored that voice because listening to it required acknowledging something he had sealed away. When he was 14 years old, standing beside two fresh graves, with no one to tell him what came next, the need for family, he rode into the town of Red Bluff on the second Tuesday of October to purchase winter supplies: salt, flour, coffee, ammunition for the rifle he used to discourage predators from his herd. The simple ingredients of a simple life. Red Bluff was not much of a town. A general store, a saloon, a livery, a scattering of buildings that looked like they had been placed on the landscape by someone who was not particularly committed to their arrangement. The kind of town that existed because two trails crossed here and people needed somewhere to stop before continuing toward wherever they were actually going. The crowd near the general store was unusual. Red Bluff did not typically generate crowds. It barely generated conversations. But today, perhaps 30 people had gathered in front of the wooden platform that normally served as a loading dock for freight wagons. Today it was serving a different purpose. Silas tied his horse and moved closer, not from curiosity, because the crowd was between him and the store entrance, and his supplies were inside. Then he saw them. Two girls standing on the wooden platform in the October wind. The older one was perhaps 13, the younger perhaps 7. They wore dresses that had been worn past the point where washing could restore them, faded and torn, and too thin for the season. Their feet were bare on the rough wooden planks. Their hair was unwashed and tangled. Their faces were smudged with the specific kind of dirt that accumulates when no one cares enough to wash it away. They were holding each other. The older girl had her arm around the younger one, with the fierce, instinctive grip of someone who has become wall and shelter and parent all at once because the adults who should have provided these things had failed so completely that a 13-year-old had absorbed their responsibilities without anyone asking her permission. The younger girl pressed into her sister's side the way small animals press into warm surfaces during storms. She clutched a cloth doll that was so worn, its features had become suggestions rather than details. Her eyes were wide and wet, and confused in the specific way that children's eyes become confused when the world stops making sense, and no one explains why. Behind them stood a man, thin, rough-faced, the kind of face that drinking carves over years, narrow eyes that calculated constantly. He wore a stained vest and a hat pushed back on his head, and the expression of a person conducting a business transaction that involved merchandise he was eager to be rid of. He was their uncle, their parents' brother, the man who had inherited responsibility for them when their mother and father were taken by cholera 6 months earlier, the man who had discovered that 2 orphaned nieces were not an inheritance but an expense, and that expenses on the frontier were luxuries that interfered with whiskey and card games. He was selling them, not with that word. The frontier had developed softer language for the practice, placing them, finding them situations, apprenticing them to families who could provide what he could not. The words were civilized. The reality beneath the words was not. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some men looked at the ground. Some women pressed their hands to their mouths. Others watched with the resigned acceptance of people who had seen hardship redistribute children before and had learned that outrage was expensive and silence was free. Silas stood at the edge of the crowd and felt something happen inside his chest that he had not felt in 21 years. The sealed place opened, not slowly, not gently. It cracked open the way ice cracks on a spring river. Suddenly, completely, with a sound that only he could hear, but that changed the temperature of everything inside him. He looked at the older girl. He saw himself, 14 years old, standing beside fresh graves. The specific look of a child who has been promoted to adult without preparation or consent. The weight of responsibility settling on shoulders that are not wide enough to carry it, but will carry it anyway, because the alternative is letting go of the only person left. He looked at the younger girl. He saw what he had never had, someone to protect, someone whose smallness demanded that his largeness serve a purpose beyond his own survival. The uncle was speaking, describing the girls as workers, strong for their ages. The older one could cook, the younger could help with household tasks. He described them the way a man describes tools at an auction, by their utility, by their function, by everything except what they actually were. Children, frightened, alone, holding each other on a wooden platform in October wind, while the adults around them calculated their value in labor and decided whether the investment was worthwhile. A rancher in the crowd offered a price for the older girl. Just the older one. He needed kitchen help. The younger one was too small to be useful. The older sister's arm tightened around her sister with a force that was visible from 30 feet away. Her dark eyes found the rancher's face, and in those eyes was something that a 13-year-old should never have to produce. The absolute ferocious refusal of a person who will not be separated from the only family remaining. The look of a small animal that will damage anything that tries to take what it is guarding. The younger girl began to cry quietly, the way children cry when they have learned that loud crying produces consequences rather than comfort. Small sounds pressed into her sister's side and absorbed by fabric that was too thin to absorb anything, but tried anyway. Silas felt the crack in his chest widen until it became a door, and through that door came 21 years of silence and solitude, and the quiet voice he had been ignoring since he was 14. He stepped forward. The crowd parted, not because he pushed through, because something in the way he moved created space the way a river creates space, naturally, inevitably, without asking. He stood before the platform. He looked up at the uncle with dark eyes that held the controlled, steady fury of a man who is choosing not to expressing it would involve actions. What expressing it would involve actions. That would not serve the two children watching from above. Both, Silas said. One word. His voice was deep and rough from disuse. A door opening after years of rust. The uncle looked at him. Calculated, named a price that was designed to discourage. Silas reached into his coat. He produced a leather pouch. He counted gold coins onto the platform with the precise, deliberate movements of a man who understands that what he is purchasing cannot actually be purchased, that the transaction is a formality, that the real exchange is happening somewhere between his chest and the two pairs of frightened eyes watching his hands. The uncle took the gold. He walked away, without looking back at the girls, without a word, without a gesture of farewell or regret or the basic human acknowledgement that he was leaving two children with a stranger. He simply collected his payment and disappeared into the saloon, the way water disappears into sand, quickly, completely, without leaving evidence it was ever there. Silas stood below the platform looking up at the two sisters. The older girl stared down at him with the suspicious defiance of someone who has learned that rescue and danger often wear the same clothes. Her arm remained locked around her sister. Her jaw was set. Her dark eyes conducted an evaluation more thorough than anything the frontier had ever produced. The younger girl peeked from behind her sister. Her wet hazel eyes found his dark ones. She studied him with the terrifying openness of a child who has not yet learned to protect herself from hope. Silas extended his hand toward the platform. Palm up, open, the way he approached horses that had been mistreated. Slowly, without demand, offering rather than taking. My name is Silas, he said. I have a ranch in the foothills. There is a creek and a cabin and a barn with a horse that is old and gentle. There is a room that has been empty for a long time. I believe it has been waiting for someone to fill it. The older girl studied his open hand. She studied his face. She looked for the things she had learned to look for in adult faces. The calculation, the assessment of utility, the measurement of what they could extract from her and her sister. She did not find it. What she found instead was something she almost did not recognize because it had been absent from her life for 6 months. Kindness. Genuine, unperforming, unrequesting kindness. The kindness of a man who was not acquiring workers. who was not purchasing labor, who was standing below a platform in October wind, with his hand open and his chest cracked wide, and 21 years of solitude, offering themselves as shelter for 2 children, who had none. The younger girl moved first. She released her grip on her sister's dress. She stepped forward on bare feet. She placed her small, dirty hand in his enormous calloused palm. Her tiny fingers disappeared inside his hand, the way a seed disappears inside soil, completely, trustingly, with the instinctive faith of something small that recognizes something safe. Silas felt her hand in his. 5 small fingers, the weight of a sparrow. The significance of an earthquake. The older girl watched. She watched her sister's hand in this stranger's hand. She watched for flinching, for tightening, for the subtle signs of possession that she had learned to read in her uncle's grip. She saw none. She saw only gentleness, the specific gentleness of a man holding something precious with hands that could crush stone, but choosing to hold it the way water holds a leaf, by letting it rest on the surface without pulling it under. The older girl stepped forward. She did not take his hand. She placed her hand on top of her sister's hand, which was inside his hand. 3 hands stacked together on the wooden platform in a town that barely existed. A family forming in the space between one here, Pate, and the next. He lifted them down from the platform, one at a time, carefully, the way a man lifts things that he intends to carry for the rest of his life. They rode north into the foothills. The older girl sat behind him on his horse. The younger sat in front, cradled between his arms and the saddle horn. She fell asleep before they reached the first ridge. Her head rested against his chest. Her small body rose and fell with his breathing. The cloth doll dangled from her relaxed hand. The older girl did not sleep. She watched the trail. She watched his hands on the reins. She watched the country opening before them. She was not yet ready to stop guarding. But the direction of her guard was shifting. She was no longer guarding against him. She was beginning to guard alongside him, the way a second wall joins a first, to create a corner, to create shelter, to create the beginning of a room. The cabin surprised them. It was warm, solid, built with the care of a man who understood that a home is not a structure, but a promise made in wood and stone. The empty room, he mentioned, had a window facing east, so morning light entered first. He had not furnished it because he had not known what furniture 2 sisters would need. He learned. He built 2 beds from pine, sanded smooth until the wood felt like something gentler than wood. He sewed mattresses from canvas and stuffed them with clean straw. He traded a calf for fabric so the older girl could make curtains for the east window. He learned to cook things other than meat and coffee. He learned to braid hair by practicing on rope until his thick fingers developed the dexterity that small heads required. He learned the rhythms of childhood that he had missed in his own. Bedtime stories constructed from half-remembered fragments and the parts he invented when the fragments ran out. The older girl's name was Clara. She told him this on the 3rd day, offering her name like a door opened 1 inch, testing whether the air on the other side was safe to breathe. The younger girl's name was Lily. She told him this on the 1st day, because 7-year-olds have not yet learned to ration trust. She told him everything, about the doll her mother made, about the creek near their old house, about the stars she liked best, and the songs she remembered, and the specific way her father used to carry her on his shoulders. Silas listened to everything. He stored each detail the way he stored winter supplies, carefully, against the cold. against the day when these memories might be needed to warm a room that weather could not reach. Clara watched him for weeks, measuring, testing, waiting for the cruelty that experience had taught her to expect from adults who acquire children. She waited for raised voices, for hard hands, for the moment the kindness revealed itself. As performance and the real transaction began, it never came. What came instead was consistency, the most radical thing the frontier could produce. Day after day of the same quiet, steady care. Coffee made before dawn, breakfast prepared without being asked. The cabin warm when they woke, the creek path cleared of stones so bare feet could walk it safely. The morning Clara called him by his name was the morning the last wall fell. Not father, not papa, just Silas, spoken across the breakfast table with the casual intimacy of someone who has stopped measuring distance and started simply existing in the space where distance used to be. He looked up from his coffee. His dark eyes met her, dark eyes, and in the space between them 21 years of his solitude and 6 months of her vigilance dissolved into something neither of them had experienced before. Family, not by blood, by choice, by the deliberate daily decision to remain. The frontier talked about them for years. The cowboy who bought 2 sisters at an auction in Red Bluff and took them to a cabin in the foothills and built them beds from pine and learned to braid hair with hands that could, shoe horses, and bend iron. They said Clara grew tall and fierce and eventually taught school in the valley where she specialized in children who had been overlooked by the adults responsible for noticing them. They said Lily kept the cloth doll her entire life and placed it on a shelf in every home she ever lived in as proof that some things survive everything. They said Silas never sold a single head of cattle from his herd during the hard winter of 1879 because selling meant reducing what he could provide, and providing had become the only language he spoke fluently. Some promises are made in churches, some in courtrooms, some in the quiet private spaces where 2 people agree to belong to each other. But the most sacred promises are made on auction platforms in October wind, by men who count gold coins, with steady hands, while their hearts make commitments that gold could never cover. Both. One word, the most expensive word Silas Cain ever spoke. More costly than any purchase he would ever make, worth more than every coin in the territory, not because of what it bought, because of what it built. The cabin still stands in the foothills, where the creek bends south. The east window still catches morning light first, and if you stand in the room where 2 pine beds once held 2 sisters who arrived barefoot and frightened and left grown and fierce and loved, you can still feel it, the warmth that a man built with his hands when his heart finally told him what his hands were for. Not survival, family. Before you ride off, tell me, what city are you watching from? Like the video. And don't forget to subscribe for more Wild West stories.